What do you mean you don't have your exact birth time? Don't you have your birth certificate? Don't they make your kind have these certificates to get around? And aren't you are you not authorized to be here? So you come for a relationship reading. To have the exact birth time would be helpful, but without it, we can look at it through your moon chart. So do you happen to know, were you born in the morning or the afternoon? Greetings, namaste, and welcome to Astrology Awakening. This is an edition dealing with calendar manipulation or alternative history. And I'm going to be using my beloved Dogon as a sort of control group of historical accuracy to keep everybody else honest. Because of the Dogon, as I've mentioned in previous videos, they have a legacy going back thousands of years, being able to predict celestial movements and having origin story that matches up with other indigenous cultures that are halfway across the world, like the Salish in Washington. They have the same origin story as the Dogon, very similar anyway. And the Dogon have as their centerpiece of their mythology the Star of Sirius. And this is where they believe we come from and then go back to during the reincarnation process. And the Dogon's lifestyle in general is very much built around the immaterial world or the astral world. They live in the deserts of Mali in these natural formations that protect them during the periodic cataclysms that they believe we go through. So, yeah, as I was saying, the Dogon sort of have a relationship with this realm and that of a lot of indigenous cultures, where they see this is, rather than being reality, this is the dream, this is the Maya, the illusion. And this is sort of evident in the Dogon's mythology of the one who brought us here is Ogo, the trickster, or the jackal, the pale fox. A lot of dog or canine-like things, and of course, where Sirius is in the dog star. It's known as, looks like a Canis Major, I think it's called. Looks like a dog. So very interesting things when you think about Anubis as well, being the guide from this realm to the next, portrayed as a dog. Anyhow, that's a tangent. So yeah, there's a confluence of a lot of things happening that make the content here really special to me. Finding out my genetic relationship, ancestry to the Dogon, all at the same time I was learning astrology. And this sort of extraordinary factor of the Dogon's calendar, what they follow, happened all pretty much in the same 3-year period. And so this is the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction that I'll get into later in the vid. So right now, let me get into the crazy calendar stuff and how history may have been collapsed and rebuilt by the controllers. What is the history of history, and how does climate and the manipulation of the calendar play into how the controlling groups are able to manipulate us? And how are the Dogon able to essentially calculate when these cycles will stabilize and destabilize our realm? So I'm going to sort of first get into the calendar manipulation, and then the second part of the video will deal with the Dogon kind of backing up what I believe to be the last 500 years of stabilizing astrological elements at play. Now, I learned a lot researching the content for this drop, so I'm going to try and distill some of what I learned and kind of the crazy concepts that go into the making of a calendar. And what is a calendar? First of all, or time itself. What is the calculation of time? It's a programming device that civilization or society uses to either self-hypnotize or is being hypnotized by to follow a certain program. Plain and simple. There is no other reason to have the ticking of seconds or minutes other than to manage the clock of the wage slave. So yeah, this is very fitting because it was the Romans who loved their slaves that started fooling around with all this. And it goes back to Julius Caesar in 45 BC, changed the previously lunar calendar to a solar calendar. One of the reasons they may have done this is Jupiter is a big thing in the Roman culture. It's their main god. I think it's Zeus, right? Jupiter takes 12 years to make its full cycle through the zodiac, and then of course the sun takes 12 calendar months to go through the zodiac. But here's where it gets tricky. Lunar calendars are based on essentially 13 cycles of the moon. They wanted to fit these 13 cycles into a 12-month, all to get 365.2 blah 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 days into 1 year. So what does this all mean? Well, if you calculate that 1 year as 12 months, we have basically in our working day, for instance, that's a year. But 12 times, they say there's 4 weeks in a month. 12 times 4 is 48. So if there's 52 weeks in a year, we're missing basically 4 weeks from that 13th month that they got rid of. And what happened in 45 BC was the year of confusion, is what they called it. So I was curious what Wikipedia had to say about the lunar calendar, and I was just kind of startled by what I found. They're saying it's 29 and a half days for each lunation, which is very contrary to what I understand both as an astrologer and just as an observer of 14 days for each new moon to turn into a full moon. Double that's 28 days. So I found this other article which is great, about a Native American tribe in Manitoba, Canada, and they followed the lunar calendar and observed 28 days. So great article to check out if you want to get away from Wikipedia's hijinks. We're going to concentrate essentially on the dialectic of two different schools of thought. One is the established chronology, we'll say, which is can be associated with someone named Joseph Scaliger, who was in the 1500s, 1600s. The other school of thought is Anatoly Fomenko, who was a Russian mathematician and born in 1945, I believe. So Fomenko came up with what we call the new chronology, and this, as a mathematician, he calculated that the Middle Ages essentially didn't exist, and that there was 1,000 years added. I'm not going to try and prove that. I need to actually research Fomenko's work itself, but just to establish what we're talking about in terms of historical manipulation, the first figure that we'll deal with is Ptolemy. He was an Egyptian mathematician, astrologer, who is pretty much single-handedly responsible for putting us on the tropical zodiac system, which is what almost everybody in Western culture uses. And maybe I should just do a demo on this. If you take a night sky app and look at the stars where they align to the sidereal zodiac that Vedic astrologers use, you see an exact match. If you use Western, you're about one sign off for every planet. And this all goes back to Ptolemy in about the 2nd century AD. So skip to the 300s, and we'll talk about Constantine the Great, because we're really, when we're talking about 180, 325 AD, 525 AD, these things can be slippery. We'll just say that there's a continuity of thought that I'm going to try and establish here, and a lot of it has to do with the names that the Romans will fool around with. But first and foremost, Constantine the Great, speaking of fooling around with names, was the one who extinguished the, at least from a historical standpoint, threat of the Christian uprisings by himself becoming a Christian. Now that's the ingenious thing to do when you've been getting your ass kicked by the Jews and then the Christians for going on 400 or 500 years during the Messianic revolts. And that's what the time of Christ and about 100, 200 years before it was all about, is the Romans having to deal with slavery uprisings because of Messianic fever. And if you can't beat them, join them. So that's what Constantine did. So, and another thing that was happening concurrently with the Messianic revolts and the Christian persecutions, feeding to the lions and all that, were the invasion by the northern tribes who had been cannon fodder for the Romans as slaves, and for hundreds of years they were getting their payback through, the Vandals and the Gauls were invading Rome and pretty much took it down by about 400. But by then Constantine had rebranded the Imperial Roman Empire as the Holy Church and pulled up stakes and moved to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople as Istanbul today. And the rest is history, as they say. So corporations do it still today. If you have a failing image, change that name, rebrand. And this is exactly what Constantine did. So now I'm going to talk about how the next couple of hundred years could have sort of turned into the next 1,000 years overnight, which it did. Our first suspect character is this cat called Dionysius Exiguus, which in Latin they translate to Dionysius the Humble, but you can call it small or petite, you might say. And this is an interesting guy because he was a monk who essentially was responsible for creating the BC AD delineation. So if you were living in Julian year 1278, this guy said, okay, now this is actually Julian year 753 because I made this day 0 AD, and this was when Christ existed, and here we go. So overnight, you have AD BC established. Now what's very suspicious about this guy, let's just start with his name. Skip 1,000 years ahead, and you have someone named Dionysius Petavius, or you might say Dionysius the Petite, or the Small. And this was a Jesuit who was a student of Joseph Scaliger, who I mentioned earlier, who himself was the king of chronology. He was a Jesuit who basically established the timeline for history. And his student, Dionysius Petavius, boasted that he counted 8,000 mistakes in this thing called the Annals Ecclesiastici, which is essentially a history of the first 12 centuries. So when you find 8,000 mistakes, count 8,000 mistakes, are pretty much the authority on history, going backwards and forwards. So if nobody noticed, these guys, who one existed in 525 because he said it was 525. The first Dionysius Exiguus, he established the AD BC, which basically is the foundation for the Gregorian calendar, which happened in 1582. So again, skip 1,000 years, or just take the 1,000 years out and say it happened then. Because here's the other thing that happened in 1582. When they established the Gregorian calendar, which took the world essentially off of the Julian calendar, it was in aid of, allegedly, getting Easter back in line with the vernal equinox or some such thing. In order to do this, similar to Caesar's year of confusion, which packed 445 or something days into one calendar year, the Pope at the time, I believe it was Gregory, Gregorian, there you go, to establish the Gregorian calendar, simply took 10 days away from October of 1582. So that was in aid of getting everything up to speed. So if you have this guy in 525 named Dionysius the Small, who's establishing AD BC, and then you have a guy who's called Dionysius the Small in the 1600s, basically, who is rewriting history and saying that he's found all these mistakes, and he is the one who is living at the same time that the Gregorian calendar is established. Smells like something. So any investigator or researcher is looking for several things when they're going down the rabbit hole. One of them is going to always be motive. You have to look at what motivates someone, or cui bono, as they've said for many centuries, who benefits. So why would you want to establish a much longer legacy if you were the holy, let's call them Constantinople Church, before they reestablish things in Rome? You want to create the illusion of a legacy. You want to create the illusion of a power base. And you certainly want to use some shenanigans with names. And this is what the Romans were definitely known for. And one of the most, I think, well-known in the research community has to do with Josephus Flavius. He was a historian born to an elite family in Jerusalem and fought in the Jewish revolts. He was born Yosef ben Matityahu. I'm sure I butchered that, but here we go. He was born a Jew and became a Roman citizen when he defected to the Romans and became a historian. And the way that writers worked in those days is you worked for a house, and he worked for the house of Flavius. He was now Joseph Flavius Josephus, and not only was he very good friends and consort with the Emperor Vespasian's son Titus, he is most noteworthy for being known as the only historian to have recorded Jesus Christ as a historical figure separate from the Gospels. So this is an interesting concept when you get down to it, because Romans loved having multiple names in the exoteric and esoteric. A lot of people conjecture, myself included, that Josephus Flavius may have been also Paul, the writer of 14 books of the New Testament. They bear striking resemblances that make them quite idiosyncratic. First and foremost, there weren't very many dual citizen, Roman citizen and Jews in those days, and especially ones that had been converted. This is the story of Yosef ben Matityahu, as well as Saul, who on the road to Damascus converted to being Paul, who, despite being born well after Jesus Christ, was converted to the teachings of Christ, and is responsible for the overwhelming majority of the New Testament. And this seems maybe to be a case of circular reporting, or wrap-up smear, as Pelosi would say, because as we know, the Romans' only method for putting down the Jewish rebellion and later the Christian revolts was to fold up shop and become the Christian church. Thus, eradicating the need for any revolts. If you followed me this far down the rabbit hole, you may be a fan of alternative history, so I recommend John Levi, the guru of this kind of research, which focuses on the deliberate disappearance from the historical record of a civilization called Tartaria, amongst many other things. It's a rabbit hole within rabbit holes, and becomes quite the obsession for the researcher. Interesting side note is the latter Dionysus the Small of the 1600s. If you ask the alternative history community, the 600s, and Levi and other channels will show many times you'll see an I in front of 3 digits that represent the year. And that I is meant to represent the year of Isis, because there is no J during that period when they were writing Jesus' name in Latin, I believe. Is that from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade as well? Anyhow, I may be getting that confused, so I've got too many threads going. Highly recommend, and this shows the dates and especially names make it very tricky when you're talking about timelines and the merging of timelines. And back to Dionysus the Small, he referenced Tartary, according to this article, and attributed Genghis Khan to be Tartarian. So is history a lie agreed upon, as Napoleon Bonaparte is credited with saying? Names and dates, that's how they get you. That's why I didn't really dig history when I was in school, because it was a rote memorization of chronology, and it didn't have a contextual impact. So when I started becoming internet investigator, being able to thread his history with mythology opened up all kinds of new doors. So that being said, let's get into the Dogon and the grand conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Capricorn, which defines their festival that they have. I did this in another video, that they had established the Dogon celebrate their Sigitolo festival in 1967 was the last one. They do it on a 60-year cycle. So the next one will be in 2027, and this is right in line with the 60-year cycle. The only time that Saturn and Jupiter have the opportunity to come together in Capricorn, which is the conjunction we had a couple of years ago. They called the Christmas conjunction, or the Christmas star. And sort of had this flavor or patina of being the star that the Magi, who are astrologers, saw and portended the birth of Christ. Mystery school teachings and esoteric teachings in general talk about the law of consent, and this is a metaphysical natural principle that anyone in power can utilize to their advantage by hiding the lie in the truth. For example, climate change is real, and this is true. Climate change is the fault of man, and so you must be taxed for being alive. This is the lie. That's, of course, the metaphysical side. The natural survival instinct of man dictates certain trajectory of existence. So when their lives are being threatened by climate change, IRL, these periodic cataclysms, there's basically a way to motivate people to do whatever you want when they know this stuff is real. And the Dogon certainly know it's real. And there's evidence in history now that I'm going to talk about having to do with something called the Little Ice Age. So this is the, I spoke about motive before, this is the means and opportunity. So this is where the powers that be, let's say, utilized the opportunity of cataclysms to disrupt any continuity of history. So you wipe out just swaths of people with volcanoes erupting, which disrupt agriculture, wipe out food sources, and whole civilizations go into pure atavistic fighting for their lives, and they're not worried about who's emperor, who's pope, and who whatever. Let's just play a little thought exercise and talk about this little ice age, which happened from 1300 till about 1800, and let's just take the 1 off. And we have the time of Constantine, the 300s, until 500 years later, which basically is the time period that I've been talking about that could have been 1,000 years added, subtracted, who knows. So I'm going to read from this New Yorker article about this time period. In China, then, is now the most populous country in the world. The Ming Dynasty fell in 1644, undermined by, among things, erratic harvest. In Europe, rivers and lakes and harbors froze, leading to phenomena as frost fairs on the River Thames. Birds iced up and fell from the sky. Men and women died of hypothermia. The King of France's beard froze solid while he slept. Some of the central events of English history turn out to have been linked to the Little Ice Age. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was destroyed by an unprecedented Arctic hurricane, a factor in the Great Fire of London. In 1666 was the ultra-dry summer that succeeded the previous bitter winter, and it goes on and on. But the gist is weather, climate, these things were wreaking havoc on the populace of the world during this period, and seem to have subsided during the 1800s. So let's look at how the Dogon observed this grand conjunction and what it has to say about these points in history. I established in a previous video, or other people had established in this article that I showed, that the Dogon celebrate every 60 years, and 1967 was the last time. So we're going to look at data points in the historical timeline of every 60 years when they may have celebrated it. It just so happens that it coincides with the grand conjunction of Saturn-Jupiter in Capricorn. Here we go. March 30th, 2020, we have Saturn-Jupiter, Jupiter 0 degrees and Saturn at 6 degrees. So this is a long stay for both of these planets together in Capricorn. Okay, so let's go back to 1961. And we see Saturn at 0 degrees, and Jupiter, that will be a nice long stay for them as well. And then we have 1902, and this is February, and Saturn is at 0 degrees, Jupiter is at 8 degrees, so another nice long stay. And going back to 1843, here we have again February, Saturn and Jupiter. Saturn's just entered at 0 degrees, Jupiter is at 19. Okay, and going back to 1784. Now, here's where we get the separation. We see Saturn has just entered Capricorn at 0 degrees, and Jupiter is like, I'll smell ya, at 29:55. Jupiter is about to make its way out. So this was a very brief, if not almost cursory, glance in the direction between these two planets. So let's go back to 1725, when would have been the last opportunity for this to have happened. And what we see here is that it does not happen. Saturn will enter in March of 1725, and Jupiter is already 11 degrees into Aquarius. So this is the, going back in time, first time we see this conjunction not happening. So let's go back one more to 1666. And here again, we see Saturn's just entered. Jupiter is 22 degrees in the next Aquarius, in the next zodiac sign. So it ain't going to happen. And where 1666 is very interesting is this is the year that Sabbatai Zevi had 1 million followers under his premise of redemption through sin, or basically bringing about the Christ return, the Messiah return, through being as naughty as possible, and that way it'll just force the Messiah to come back. So this was how desperate these people were at the time to get any kind of relief from what was going on. And ancient truths have been being hijacked by controlling powers to manipulate the populace for eons. And this is always the case with climate change. There are natural cataclysms that happen. As the outcast scientist, brilliant mind Immanuel Velikovsky was trying to tell people in the middle of the 20th century, and the indigenous cultures, including the Dogon, back him up with the Birkeland Current-like images that you'll see on petroglyphs throughout the world. And this is all sort of backing up this little ice age, which I highly recommend everybody delve into more to discover how the climate was destabilized quite a bit during this period, and started to stabilize in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction became more potent. And my favorite of this period to bring up is the one they say caused the French Revolution, which was the series of volcanic eruptions in Iceland, the Laki volcanoes. And this happened right around the time of this near conjunction. The next time it happened, this was the end of the little ice age. And this is also possibly where a lot of the vampire lore comes from, because apparently, like, Europe was plagued by black clouds and agricultural devastation, weird things happening to farm animals. Anyhow, I'll leave it there because this is a really long video, but thank you all for watching. It means a lot, and I'll see you in the next one. Namaste.